Could a medieval king truly do whatever he wanted? The image is one of absolute power, a monarch whose every whim becomes law, whose single command can raise armies or topple cities. But history is rarely so simple. The crown, heavy as it was, sat upon a head that was constantly forced to look over its shoulder, to bargain, to persuade. The story of medieval kingship is not a monologue of command, but a continuous, often fraught dialogue of power. It's tempting to believe that a single document, like Magna Carta, could destroy royal power overnight. We picture rebellious barons forcing King John's hand in 1215, creating a constitutional monarchy in a single stroke. The reality was far more incremental. The Great Charter was not a universal declaration of rights. It was a fiercely negotiated list of specific concessions, primarily for the benefit of the aristocracy. It constrained certain royal practices, like arbitrary scutage and the abuse of wardships, and secured baronial liberties. It was forced upon the king, yes, but it was a partial victory, a single, albeit significant, moment in a centuries-long tug-of-war. Its clauses were a foundation, not a completed fortress against tyranny. Power, we are told, flows from the divine right of kings, but more often, it flowed from the exchequer. A king's authority often hinged on his finances far more than his lineage. The pageantry of the crown was expensive and warfare was ruinous. To fund their ambitions, kings had to levy taxes, secure massive loans from Italian bankers or wealthy merchants, and impose wartime duties. Each of these actions required negotiation. Kings had to summon councils of magnates and representatives from towns, bartering for their consent in exchange for confirmations of privileges or legal redress. The crown was only as powerful as the coin it could command, and that coin often came with strings attached. While kings were the ultimate source of justice, their own courts could become a check on their power. As royal legal systems grew more sophisticated, particularly in places like England with its common law, they established procedures and precedents. These legal frameworks created a new reality. The king was, in theory, subject to the law he promulgated. The ability to sue the crown or its officials, though limited, became a political tool. Rulings issued by royal judges could, over time, weave a net of legal constraints that limited the monarch's ability to act with pure, unbridled caprice. The law, once a tool of royal power, was slowly becoming its master. And then there was the power that claimed authority not from any earthly kingdom, but from God himself. The church was a formidable force, and popes and bishops wielded very real power over even the mightiest monarchs. Ecclesiastical authorities held a potent arsenal of spiritual weapons. They could excommunicate a king, casting him out from the Christian community and releasing his subjects from their oaths of fealty. They could place an entire kingdom under interdict, suspending sacraments and religious services, which was a terrifying prospect for a deeply pious populace. The infamous conflict between England's Henry II and Archbishop Thomas Becket, which ended in martyrdom and the king's public penance, was a stark reminder that no king ruled without answering to a higher and often very political power. A king without his nobles was, in practice, a king without a kingdom. The great earls, dukes, and barons were not mere subjects. They were regional power brokers. They controlled vast estates, commanded their own private armies of knights and retainers, and held formidable castles that were the physical anchors of their authority. In many territories, they collected taxes and administered justice in the king's name, but with a high degree of autonomy. A monarch could not simply issue commands from his capital and expect them to be obeyed. He had to constantly bargain with his magnates, seeking their counsel, rewarding their loyalty with land and titles, and fearing their collective wrath. Their support was essential for war, for governance, and for the very stability of the realm. Beyond the castle walls, a new power was rising in the burgeoning towns and cities. As trade flourished, urban communes grew wealthy and ambitious. They were not content to be ruled by a distant lord or king. Through collective bargaining, and often with hefty payments, towns negotiated for royal charters that granted them a startling degree of autonomy. These charters gave them the right to elect their own officials, run their own courts, and even raise their own militias. In return, the king received a reliable source of income and a potential ally against his powerful nobles. But this came at a cost. Urban power created pockets of self-governance that checked the king's direct reach, transforming the political map into a more complex mosaic of overlapping jurisdictions. In an age before standing armies and modern diplomacy, marriage was a primary instrument of geopolitical policy. A royal wedding was never just a personal affair, it was a strategic alliance, a peace treaty, and an economic contract rolled into one. The choice of a bride could secure a border, gain a claim to a foreign throne, or cement a crucial alliance against a rival. But this tool also created constraints. A king's marriage often required the consent of his great nobles, and the terms were subject to intense bargaining with foreign courts. These dynastic alliances created a web of obligations and entanglements that could bind a king's hands for a generation, pulling him into foreign conflicts or forcing his hand in domestic policy. When a king's own vassals could not provide enough soldiers, he often turned to mercenaries. These professional soldiers, Swiss pikemen, Genoese crossbowmen, Flemish spearmen, could provide a decisive edge in battle and were loyal only to the paymaster. This offered a king short-term power, allowing him to bypass reluctant nobles and crush internal rebellions. But these hired guns came with a steep price, both financial and political. An over-reliance on mercenaries drained the royal treasury, created immense debt, and was often deeply resented by the native nobility. Furthermore, a mercenary captain with a large army could become a political force in his own right, making demands and posing a threat if payments were late. The assemblies we now call parliaments did not emerge from a grand democratic vision. They grew from the messy, practical necessity of bargaining. Early parliaments and royal councils were ad hoc gatherings, summoned by kings when they needed something, usually money. To secure consent for a new tax, a monarch had to summon the three estates, the clergy, the nobility, and increasingly, representatives from the towns. In these assemblies, consent was traded for redress. Subjects presented petitions, aired grievances, and demanded confirmations of their rights. Over time, these pragmatic bargains became institutionalized, evolving into regular mechanisms of governance where the king's will was debated, challenged, and shaped by the consent of the governed. The king's law, his royal writ, was supposed to run throughout the land, but in reality it often stopped at the moat of the next great castle. Fortresses were the ultimate expression of local power. A nobleman securely ensconced in a stone keep, with his own garrison and food supplies, could effectively defy royal orders for months, if not years. Castles controlled key roads, rivers, and territories. To subdue a rebellious magnate, a king had to undertake a costly and difficult siege. The sheer military reality of these private strongholds meant that a king's authority was often conditional, enforced only where his armies could physically reach and where local lords chose to cooperate. To project an image of power, kings used every tool at their disposal. Propaganda was a medieval art form. The king's face on a coin, his grand titles on official documents, the sacred pageantry of his coronation, all were designed to communicate an aura of divinely ordained, unshakable authority. This royal image was a crucial tool for legitimizing rule and commanding obedience. But it often masked the complex reality of bargaining that took place behind the throne. The magnificent portrait of a king holding the orb and scepter did not show the tense negotiations with his council or the desperate loans taken to fund his army. Image was a projection of power, not definitive proof of it. Beneath the king's law lay an even older and more resilient force: custom. In villages and regions across Europe, daily life was governed by local customary law, unwritten traditions that had been passed down for generations. These folk laws dictated inheritance, land use, and social obligations. A king who violated these deeply ingrained customs did so at his peril. Arbitrary actions that flew in the face of accepted tradition could provoke widespread resentment and even open rebellion. Custom acted as a powerful organic check on royal power, binding even the king to the unwritten rules of his own people. The limits on royal power were never more apparent than during the reign of a child king. When a monarch died, leaving a minor as heir, the kingdom entered a period of profound vulnerability and negotiation. A regency council, typically composed of the most powerful magnates and bishops, would be established to rule in the young king's name. This was inherently a system of power sharing. Authority was fractured, and rival factions on the council vied for influence over the boy king and control of the realm. A minority reign was a stark illustration that royal authority was not purely personal, it was institutional, and when the person of the king was weak, the power of the magnates inevitably grew stronger. In a world with few contracts and no police force, public words had immense power. Oaths were the bedrock of the political order. At his coronation, a king swore an oath to uphold the laws and protect the church. Vassals, in turn, swore oaths of fealty to their lord. These were not mere symbolic gestures. They were sacred, politically binding commitments, often sworn on holy relics. Breaking an oath was a grave sin and a political crime that could justify rebellion. These sworn promises created a network of enforceable obligations that shaped royal choices and provided a powerful moral and legal framework for resisting a king who overstepped his sworn duties. When all other forms of negotiation failed, there was rebellion. Nothing curbed a king's ambitions quite like an armed revolt. Uprisings by powerful noble coalitions, organized communes, or even desperate peasants were a recurring feature of the medieval political landscape. While many rebellions were brutally crushed, their very possibility acted as a deterrent against extreme tyranny. More often, the threat or reality of revolt forced kings to the negotiating table. They were compelled to concede rights, reverse unpopular policies, and issue charters to restore peace. Rebellion was the ultimate violent expression of the medieval social contract. A king who pushed his subjects too far risked losing everything. Ironically, one of the ways kings sought to overcome these limitations ultimately created new ones. To extend their power, they built elaborate bureaucracies. Chanceries filled with clerks produced a torrent of official documents. An exchequer managed royal finances with increasing sophistication. Itinerant justices traveled the realm, bringing the king's law to the localities. In the long run, this centralization did strengthen royal authority. But it did so by creating institutions. Power became less personal and more dependent on a growing class of professional administrators and legal experts. The king's weaponry was now paperwork, but it was paperwork that followed rules and procedures. While battles and sieges capture the imagination, the map of Europe was shaped more by ink than by steel. Diplomacy was a constant, complex game of statecraft. Kings and their envoys were perpetually engaged in negotiations, forging treaties, and arranging marriages. These diplomatic agreements could be more decisive than any single battle, setting long-term borders, establishing trade rights, and creating alliances that constrained a king's future actions. A treaty signed to end one war could limit a king's ability to start another, binding him to terms that affected his successors for generations. Diplomacy was the art of achieving by negotiation what was too costly or risky to achieve by force. This is not to say that medieval kings were powerless. They could, and often did, abuse their power. They could impose crushing taxes, seize land arbitrarily, and eliminate rivals with ruthless efficiency. Such acts of raw power could be brutally effective in the short term, but they always came with a cost. Each act of tyranny risked alienating a key segment of the political community: the nobles, the clergy, the towns. Over time, these abuses could foster resentment, encourage elite conspiracies, and provide the justification for ecclesiastical sanction or popular revolt. Arbitrary power worked until the moment it created a coalition strong enough to make it stop. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, legal reforms began to empower subjects. The growth of common law in England, for instance, created a body of precedent and procedure that was accessible to a wider range of people. The development of written ordinances and legal codes elsewhere provided a clearer standard against which a king's actions could be judged. These legal innovations were not revolutionary acts. They were a check in slow motion. They created new tools, new arguments, and new avenues for subjects to frame their resistance to royal excess not as rebellion, but as a defense of the law itself. The notion of the absolute monarch, a ruler with total and unquestioned power, is largely a myth projected backward onto the Middle Ages. In reality, most medieval kings lived in a state of constant, dynamic balance. Their rule was a performance, pairing the symbolic theater of absolutism with the practical daily reality of negotiation. They were at the apex of the social pyramid, but they were not outside of it. Their authority was real, but it was contingent on consent, constrained by law and custom, and continually challenged by powerful nobles, the church, and their own subjects. The true nature of medieval kingship was not absolute command, but the relentless, unending art of the bargain. Medieval monarchy was never a single tool, but a whole toolkit: symbols, money, law, and negotiation. If a king looked absolute, chances are a network of nobles, bishops, and towns were shaping his choices. Like if this surprised you, and tell us which moment you want a deep dive on.